This morning's lesson is entitled, Who Was That? The random ways that you come up with a lesson idea. Because actually this one came from an idea from a book that we were looking at a couple of days ago, this last week, and it talks about those who are unnamed in the Bible. So one idea and thought I had was kind of, have you ever been in the grocery store or someplace out and about and, you get a lot of this one. Someone just waves at you going down the road. Who was that? Or what's even worse is you're standing there talking to them and have a full conversation with somebody and will walk away and you start scratching your head saying, who was that? So, and some of the idea of this is how many people that in conversation was important, the thing was great, everything was fine, but sometimes we have to stop and think, how many people do things that are important that don't go recognized by name? Even in the movie, if you carried a mop bucket around, you got a real quick little spot on the size 6 font at the very end of the credits. You're not one of the big names at the beginning, but you sometimes get credit there. Some of the crew may not, but you get different things. There are several in the Bible that do not have their names announced, yet they were very instrumental. I'm going to focus this morning primarily on one group of people. And then at the end, I've got a few others listed as items to go back for individual review and ideas. But the opening verse for this is going to be Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 7. So out of our chapter of faith, verse 7 says, By faith Noah, being warned of God of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house, by the which he condemned the world, and became heir to the righteous, which is by faith. Then the remaining, most of what we're going to look at kind of falls through Genesis. If you want to turn to Genesis chapter 6, we will look from there through chapter 9 at the account of Noah and his house. So as it looks at it, we have a group of people mentioned very vaguely. But yet Noah is very prominent in what he has been given. He is definitely there. But as we look through it, we see the chapter, we never know the women. We see the wives of Noah and his sons through Genesis chapter 6 through 9. Noah's mentioned quite frequently. His sons are given their names, but yet the wives are just always referred to as wives. Are they so much less that they don't get a name? I imagine that they called their wives by name. They probably had one, but it's a question of, what were they? Now, as far as the account here, and we look at the overall, we usually look at this as being the righteousness of the area, but we look inside of here and we see that they're never recorded. What can we know about them? And that is a question that got posed in this book that got my mind thinking about it. How many times do we read the Bible and see the different names? Even when we see names, do we just skim through? Do we take time to recognize where they're at or where they're from? So as we look at this, some things to think about these unnamed wives. Probably took and did this sermon too early. I probably should have kept this in my back pocket for Mother's Day, but it's here for you today. One thing we can recognize by this is that they also received the commandments to enter the ark. If we look at chapter 6 and starting with verse 13, God said unto Noah, The end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. He then goes through giving him some commands, and in verse 18 we pick back up saying, But with thee, to Noah, I will establish my covenant, And thou shalt come into the ark, thou, thy sons, thy wife, and the sons of the wives of thy sons. We see that they also received that. They had the invitation. On the invitation, it had them included. And verse 22 mentions that thus did Noah according to all that God commanded. And in chapter 7 says, And the Lord said unto Noah, Come, thou and all thy house into the ark. For thee have I seen righteous before me in this generation. Now we see specifically in the text that Noah himself was righteous. The question then becomes, were the wives as well? Or his sons? Would God save the unrighteous at this time? So as we look at this and dig deeper into this idea, we see, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but I'm going to finish my sentence anyway, that God is not that word is jumping out of my head now. He is not going to take and do something for one person, but not for the other. Respecter of persons. We take and see that he said the wicked will perish. Therefore, if the wives received the invitation, what were the wives? They must also have been righteous in their actions towards God. So they would have followed the commandments of God. As we continue through the account here, we see going down into verse 7 of chapter 7, And Noah went in, and his sons and his wives and his sons' wives went with into the ark because of the waters of the flood. Verse 13 continues, In the same day Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, his sons, the sons of Noah, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons went with them into the ark. That's got to be a fun thing to know that, the father is mentioned, the 3 sons are mentioned, and then the wives. And the wives went with. As awkward as it sounds to say that, you're just called a wife, if I was one of the wives at the time, I don't think I'd complain. Because I got the invitation. And I was on the boat. So we see some of this idea as they continued. We see at the end there of verse 16, and they went in, the animals all went in, as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. So all of this happened and transpired that the ladies got the invitation. We still don't know who they are. We found out who the sons are because we are told the lineage, but we still don't know any of the ladies' names. But yet we see that everyone survived the destruction, which means we can pull a lot of information from this as we go forward. One of the main thoughts I have about this, about these 4 women, Mrs. Noah and the 3 sons' wives, we see that a good woman can help lead her family in righteousness and be a helpmeet for her husband. We see this at the very beginning of time with Adam and Eve. Adam was alone on the earth and had no helpmeet for him. And what did God do? Created a helpmeet for Adam. Someone to help him along the process. So as we look at this idea of what the women in this account are, we see that Noah had his family of 3 sons who are all counted as righteous. And all of them had righteous wives. Talk about a proud father moment right there. You are righteous towards God. You are in a world of unrighteousness. You have 3 sons and you have 3 daughter-in-laws and a wife, and all of you are righteous. How many of us would love that today? That our entire family would stay righteous to the Lord, and that they would find helpmeets for them that would also be righteous and stay that way. In this day and time, I think, we think it difficult just to do that with our limited number of years, but think about Noah. As I've got down here looking at back and forth and trying to find these numbers to try and keep it as accurate as I can, I hope I didn't miss any of it, but Noah, according to the account, was about 500 years old when he started work on the ark. So to live for 500 years, you had 3 sons, and all of you remained righteous throughout this whole time, while the whole world around you was completely and utterly unrighteous, to the point that it grieved God and that he was going to destroy all living. We see that he was 500, and I found that in chapter 5, verse 32. This one took a little more digging, but as they worked on the ark, and think about this process here. Not only were you righteous for this time period, but work on the ark took 100 years about. He was 500, he was about 600 when they got done with the ark. Can you imagine being a family member? What's the family business? We're building an ark. A what? Yeah, it's going to flood. A what? You imagine how many times you got asked, what? In that time period. They had never had a flood before. They had never had this kind of destruction. And yet he's building a massive boat, not at the water, to go fishing out of. What is on this man's mind? So to think about the support that this woman would have had, all 4 of these women probably, that they were all, since they're, the account doesn't give us a lot of detail. It says that they built it according to God's command. So I don't think that Noah worked alone. He would have had to have had support of some sort by his wife and by his sons and their wives, whether it be through helping with preparations, through the home, with all these things. How much would their wives have stood beside and with them? So the workload took over a year by all members on board, all 6 to cover. Okay, imagine the workload while on the ark. That'll make the rest of that sentence sound a little more intelligent. Once they boarded the ark and God sealed them in, the important part there of the spiritual side of things is God closed and sealed the door. He is the one who made judgment, like we were talking this morning in Bible study. God is the righteous judge. He sealed the door, but once they were sealed inside, they were inside for a little over a year. Can you imagine the workload for 6 people to have 3 decks worth of animals, plus yourselves, to feed? If you feed it, you got to clean up after it. And you also have to keep yourselves together and everything else. Imagine the workload. Imagine all the tasks that had to go day by day and all of the process by everyone on board. I'm sure there were plenty of places to try and hide on that ship, but since they were all counted as righteous, I don't think they were hiding and trying to get away from their duties. If your duty was to clean deck 3 and you didn't do it, I'm sure it went noticed. So think about the process, the character of all 6 of these people, even the 3 that did not have a name. Throughout their worship and everything else, throughout their duties, throughout their process while they were floating around, once the water subsided, then what happened? If we go up to chapter 8 and we look at, starting at verse 15, what happened when the ship, the ark, landed and dry land was available? Verses 15 to 21 goes, "And God spake unto Noah, saying, Go forth of the ark, thou and thy wife and thy sons and the sons' wives with thee. Bring forth with thee the living things that were with thee, all the flesh, both the fowl and the cattle, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that may breed abundantly in the earth, and be fruitful, and multiply upon the earth. And Noah went forth, and his sons, and his wife, and his sons' wives with him. Every beast, every creeping thing, every fowl, whatsoever creeps upon the earth, after their kinds went forth out of the ark. They have been able to step outside. And Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled a sweet savor, and the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake. For the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, neither will I again smite any more every living thing as I have done. A lot of times I read that verse too quickly, too many times. He built an altar and offered a sacrifice. No. He built an altar, and took of every clean beast and every clean fowl and offered burnt offerings. How long was that sacrifice? How many animals did that go? And to offer the sacrifice, it had to be done in a certain way, so he would have gone through a process to offer all of that. I don't think he did it alone. I would have to assume that he would have had help with the whole process of disembarking the ark, letting everything out, getting back out, building the altar in the first place. Now, when we get up to the Israelite nation, it was the priests, and we had specific people that would do specific tasks. But at this time here, there were only 6 people around. And they were all adults. So I have a feeling, 8 people. He had 3 sons, 3 wives, and him and his wife. 8 adults. I would imagine that to worship, they would all be together to do so. Especially if they were counted righteous in the first place, that they were able to enter the ark. What all is not being said in these passages? We see the amount of work that would have been done there. Once they got off, what was the first thing they did? They worshiped. It does not say what they did throughout the time that they were on the ark, but we know that there would have been plenty of tasks to do, but I would imagine they would have remembered God in the process as well. So the big thing is, could Noah have done this by himself? First off, in his time, in his first 500 years before the flood, would he have, is it possible that he could have remained righteous that whole time without a helpmeet? It's possible. People have done things on their own. Paul was a bachelor his life, so we know it can be done. But how much easier is it when you have someone there at your side? Especially when the world around you is going down. What about his sons? We don't hear much about them, other than they helped with all of this. Another question we could ask, would God have commanded that the wives go in the ark if they too were not living righteously? We've kind of looked at it. He's not a respecter of persons, so I don't think they would have made it on the ark. That would have been an interesting, honey, I love you, as they departed someone on the ark and some say down. That would have been quite interesting. Imagine how those, maybe it would have taken longer than 100 years to build the ark if they weren't all on board. But they were all counted that direction. Something I thought about in a comparison, I wonder who the writer of Proverbs was thinking about when they wrote Proverbs 31. Proverbs was written after this time, because after this, the commandment was to repopulate the earth, and then after that, we see the development of the nations, of the lineage and everything. So Proverbs was done after the time of Noah. Were the wives considered in some of this writing? Or was it someone else? Could it fit? I've taken several of the verses out of Proverbs chapter 31 and put them on the outline here. Starting with part of verse 10, we see, who can find a virtuous wife? Noah and his 3 sons did. Even in a world full of wickedness and so much evil in their hearts, Noah and his 3 sons found virtuous wives. Imagine the character. Now, were they virtuous when they found them, or did they help them to become virtuous? We don't know that answer. But an interesting question and an interesting idea, but who can find one? As we continue, look at verse 12. She does him good and not evil. Think about all the struggles they would have faced. First, just being in a wicked world surrounded by everyone, that no one else listened to the preaching of Noah and got on that ark. So everyone around them was evil, was doing evil things, was not listening. But yet, so imagine the hardship that would have been faced going through that process. The wives did good and not evil. Verse 17, she girds herself with strength. You need strength to stay virtuous. When we pray, do we pray for strength? Do we pray for understanding? In that, do we look for the strength to continue to go forward? As we continue through, we'll look at also verses 20, I've marked down 25 through 28. Strength and honor are her clothing. She shall rejoice in time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and on her tongue is the law of kindness. She watches over the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. Does this sound like the wives that we read about in Genesis 6 through 9, from Noah's wife and his sons' wives? There's so much more inside of Proverbs 31, but these, I think, were some of the highlights, some of the high points of the character of a righteous woman. The character that I would expect to see through the wives that were mentioned in this section. Do we know what they are like? Yes and no. They were righteous. They were counted good and were labeled, not by name, but they were labeled. They were added there. It wasn't just told Noah and your sons, it was and your wives. I think that in itself speaks volumes. We have many other examples in the Bible and only have a couple listed here. The more I sit and think about it, the more we can come up with additional names for it. And I had to go back. I thought this one, but I had to go back and read it about twice just to make sure. I've talked about him recently, but in John chapter 9, there was a man born blind. And they asked about this man, is that, this was a man that Jesus healed on the Sabbath. And so the religious leaders took great issue with this just because he healed on the Sabbath. Question: is God constrained to a certain time frame or a day of the week? I don't think so. He created all things in the first place. If he wants to heal any day of the week, he can heal on any day of the week. But in John chapter 9, Jesus took and healed this man who was just labeled as born blind. He was blind since birth. He had told him to go and do things, and his apostles or his disciples had asked in verse 2, and his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Well, that was kind of a goofy question in the first place, because until you're born, can you even sin? You haven't even been born yet. But Jesus answered, Neither has this man sinned nor his parents, but the works of God should be manifest in him. I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night comes when no man can work. The point is not to be conformed to a specific day, but when we look at this man here, he was a man. He is of age as we continue through and read through the process where the Jewish leaderships are trying to pin him down. They don't even call him by name. His parents aren't even mentioned by name. His parents don't call him by name. They just say, ask him. He's of age. How joyful is this story? It doesn't put the focus on him. It leaves the focus on what has happened. What has happened is that this man was blind and Jesus was able to do what he came to do, to show the power of God, to work the works, to show the heart, and show the faith. That the works of God should be revealed in him or through him. The name's not always important. There was a paralytic man that was, we remember, usually we had 4 people carry him. They couldn't get to Christ, and so they took and removed the roof of the house and lowered him onto the table in front of Jesus. Can you imagine sitting in a room leading a class or leading a discussion, and someone takes off the roof above your head and lowers someone down on a stretcher in front of you? Okay, let's back up and also look at it from another angle. Can you imagine being the owner of that house and your roof is taken off by 4 strangers to lower a person down onto your table? But yet, the faith of this one and his 4 friends. Do you think the 4 carrying the stretcher, carrying this man around, would do it just because, and if they didn't believe either? This man said, I must go and see Jesus. I must see him. He is doing great things. I believe in him. I want to hear what he has to say. He had faith. We know that through what is told. Because when they asked him when he said, your sins are forgiven, the ruckus in the room came up about, how can you say that? I said, all right, take up your mat and walk. His faith is what was shining through. We have the 4 men that carried him. We have the man that was paraplegic. He went away rejoicing. None of them had a name recorded, but yet all of them tell a story. How many times in the scriptures are the masses described? When he came healing, people would come. So many without a name were there, would follow. How many people followed him day by day? We know that the apostles had to have been there to receive his teachings directly, so we have at least 13 names. 14 and when we add Paul in as the late apostle, the later one. But how many more were there? All of them played a role. All of them had things. They were following him, being healed, fed, spoken about by Christ or the apostles. How many people did Jesus even use as examples in his ministry that just happened to be there? We can also turn back to Hebrews chapter 11 in our faith chapter. What is the idea about Hebrews chapter 11? We see so many listed by faith, this person, by faith, through faith, to each of these people until we get down to verse 35. Verse 35 changes it up. All of a sudden, verse 35 starts off saying, women receive their dead to receive life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover, of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskin and goatskin, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, having obtained good report. How many more are not listed here? He covers it there by saying others, they, opens that door that these are not the only ones. This is not all we can learn. Our name, none of our names in this room are listed in Hebrews chapter 11, the chapter of faith. But do we have faith? Do we have to be listed in Hebrews chapter 11 to have faith? I'm glad the answer is no, because otherwise that would not be fair. Because we weren't born when this was written, so how could our name be there? And if everyone that had faith was written down, that book would be humongous. The question is, are we counted faithful in service to God? Whether our name is written down in the record books or not. They keep a record of our birth, they keep a record of our death, they keep a record of our taxes, they keep record of a lot of things, but they cannot record our faith. Do we keep that in mind? Do we keep in mind that which is not recorded? We don't see all the deeds of everyone that's been listed here, but yet we know that they are there. We must be faithful in following His command, and our name will be written where it counts, where it matters, in the book of life. We see this throughout Revelation. I've got several verses written there. The main point in each of these verses that it shows is that we see two phrases repeated in those areas. To him that overcometh, and he who has an ear, let him hear. If we overcome, our name doesn't have to be specifically written. We don't have to have that because we see what has happened to those that are without a name in here. The wives were always just known as, in the scripture right here, the wives. Does it matter what the names were? Now, it's always nice to be called by name, to receive an award, or to be given praise for something, but the real praise I need, the real praise any of us actually need, is not something that we can earn of our own. It is something that we must have and understand. Who was that? Maybe we should go back to the open tomb when Mary was there and someone said, he who you seek is not here. Who was that? I hope that we never have to ask the question, who was that, when we talk about the commands of Christ. When we talk about Christ and His ministry, I hope we never have the question of, who is that? Unfortunately, there are too many in the world that don't know when you say Jesus Christ, they say, who is that? That means we have our work ahead of us. Will we work? Will we go forward and bring the good news to those around us? Will we continue to try and encourage others and to bring them the knowledge of who that is? Let us bring Christ in our lives. Let us do what our task is. This evening we talk about go where. Almost kind of ties into this idea. We know who Christ is. Does everyone around us? That is the main name we need to know. Don't ask who was that about Christ. Because on the final day we will all know who that is. Unfortunately, by that day, if that is the first time you know who He is, it will be too late. So if we have need of the invitation, I invite you to come. While we go through the process of this life, if we have struggles or needs as we go about day by day, let your needs be known. Let us help extend a hand. Let us take and help encourage one another. Whether our name is written on the prayer list or just in the hearts of each other, let us know what we can do for each other. Our song of invitation is number 589. I invite you to come while together we stand and sing.